The city burned under an alien sky, its towers collapsing in clouds of ash and fire. Soldiers ran through the streets, shouts mixing with the crack of weapons and the roar of explosions. Among them moved a human named Kale, his armor dented, his arms streaked with blood and soot. He was not here to fight anymore. He was here to get out alive. But survival was not going to be simple in this war zone. From the shadows of a crumbling wall, something moved fast. A flash of steel cut through the smoke, striking him once in the side and then again in the ribs. The force made him stumble, his vision blurring for a second. When his eyes focused, he saw her. A young alien woman with glowing blue skin and hair like molten pink fire stood before him, her blade trembling in her hands. Her breaths were sharp, eyes burning with hatred. She had stabbed him with all the strength she had, yet he was still standing. He could have ended her there. He had the strength, the weapon, and every reason to do so. She had tried to kill him, and in war, mercy was a weakness. But then the ground shook with another blast. Fire poured into the street behind her, swallowing buildings like they were paper. A falling beam crashed near her feet, sparks scattering across her skin. In that moment, Kale saw not an enemy, but someone trapped in the same nightmare. Without thinking, he stepped forward. She tried to strike again, but his hand caught her wrist. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her toward him with a strength that made her drop the blade. She struggled, cursing him in her native tongue, yet her eyes flickered with fear at the fire closing in. The heat grew unbearable, the flames chasing them like hungry predators. Kale turned, shielding her with his body as they ran through the smoke-filled street. His wounds slowed him, each step sending pain through his chest. But he kept moving, his grip on her firm. She could feel the blood on his armor, smell the iron mixed with smoke, yet he did not let go. They ducked into a half-collapsed building as another explosion lit the sky behind them. The sound was deafening, shaking the broken walls. She stared at him, confused. Why was this human, the enemy she had tried to kill, risking himself for her? They moved again, weaving through debris and fire. At one point, she stumbled over a fallen beam, and he lifted her easily, carrying her against his side. His breathing was ragged, sweat dripping from his brow, but his arms did not falter. The street ahead was a tunnel of fire, the air thick with smoke and ash. Through it all, his eyes stayed locked on the path forward, never on the wounds she had given him. They reached the edge of the city where the flames were less fierce. The night air hit them like a blessing, though it still smelled of burning metal. Kale set her down carefully, his hands finally releasing her. She stepped back, still catching her breath, staring at him as if trying to understand what just happened. Around them, the war raged on, but here, for a moment, there was only silence between two enemies who had shared the same fire. Before she could speak, another blast echoed from the heart of the city, lighting their faces in red and gold. She looked toward the flames, then back at him. He was hurt, but still standing tall, his expression calm despite the chaos. Something in her chest shifted, a strange weight she had never felt before. This human was not like the others she had been taught to hate. And though she did not know why, she realized she was no longer thinking of him as an enemy. Kale leaned against the blackened wall, the heat from the city still pressing against his back. His breathing was heavy, each inhale tasting of ashen metal. The alien woman stood a few steps away, still holding her side where his grip had been. Her eyes followed him, cautious yet unreadable. Neither spoke for a moment, as if words might shatter the strange pause between them. When she finally did speak, her voice was cold but softer than before. She asked why he had saved her when he had every reason to let her burn. He met her gaze, without flinching, and told her simply that leaving someone to die in the fire, even an enemy, was something he could not do. She frowned, as if the answer made no sense to her. In her world, mercy was for the weak, and kindness was often a trap, They both turned their heads as the ground trembled again, a distant explosion lighting the smoke-filled sky. The fire was spreading faster than they expected, and the glow in the distance meant the battle had moved closer. Kale pushed away from the wall and motioned for her to follow. She hesitated, still torn between pride and survival, but the heat on her face was enough to make her steps match his. As they moved through the ruined streets, Kale noticed her slight limp. He slowed his pace without saying anything, making it seem as though he was scanning for danger. In truth, he was matching her speed so she would not fall behind. She caught on to his quiet adjustment and narrowed her eyes at him, still suspicious of his intentions. Yet her breathing eased as she realized he would not leave her behind. They crossed what had once been a market square, now reduced to rubble and scattered bodies. The air carried the acrid scent of burned supplies and charred metal. She glanced at the fallen soldiers, some human, some alien, and her jaw tightened. Kale saw the way her eyes lingered on one particular armored figure before she turned away sharply. There was pain there, but she would not speak of it. A sharp whistle sliced through the air, and Kale's instincts took over. He grabbed her arm and pulled her down behind a broken wall, just as a barrage of plasma fire tore through the street. Shards of stone and metal sprayed over them, some cutting shallow lines across his exposed skin. She stared at him again, not because of the attack, but because his first reaction had been to shield her. When the gunfire stopped, they stayed low, listening for any sign of the enemy. Kale's hand remained steady on his weapon while his eyes searched the shadows. She could hear his heartbeat, steady despite the chaos. For the first time, she realized that his calmness was not arrogance. It was control, the kind that kept both of them alive. That realization unsettled her more than she expected. They moved again, this time sticking close to the narrow alleys where the flames had not yet reached. Every step was a careful calculation, every turn a gamble. The war raged on in the distance. But here, their battle was survival. And as the night wore on, the strange truth settled deeper into her thoughts. This human, wounded by her own hand, was now the only reason she was still breathing. They reached the edge of the old transport yard, its steel frames warped from the heat. The air shimmered above the cracked ground, and the scent of smoke clung to everything. Kale scanned the perimeter, noting the faint hum of enemy drones in the distance. The alien woman stood at his side now, no longer trailing behind, though her hand still hovered near the hilt of a smaller blade she had kept hidden. He pointed toward a collapsed hangar at the far end of the yard, explaining it might have a path out to the safer side of the district. She tilted her head, skeptical, but followed without arguing. The ground was littered with scattered debris-charged supply crates, broken weapons, and the remains of shattered glass. Every step made a crunch beneath their boots, a sound that carried too far in the quiet moments between the distant blasts. Halfway to the hangar, the hum of drones grew louder. Kale signaled for her to duck behind a twisted piece of plating. They crouched in the shadows as two enemy machines hovered into view, their sensors sweeping in rhythmic arcs. The alien woman's breath slowed as she prepared to strike if needed. But Kale rested a hand lightly on her forearm, signaling her to wait. His patience paid off when the drones turned away and drifted back toward the burning city. Inside the hangar, the air was cooler but thick with dust. Beams of dim light cut through gaps in the roof, illuminating the wreck of an old transport craft. Kale moved to check the far wall for any intact exits while she examined the ship. Her fingers brushed over the strange markings on its hull, recognition flashing in her eyes. She whispered something in her language, almost too soft for him to hear. Before shaking her head and stepping back, they found a partially open maintenance door at the far end, blocked by fallen crates. Kale began shifting them quietly, muscles straining with the effort. She joined him without a word, and together they cleared just enough space to squeeze through. The night air outside felt fresher, though the distant glow of flames reminded them that the danger was far from over. She glanced at him, and for a moment their eyes met without any hostility. Beyond the hangar, the street sloped downward toward the river. Cale knew that crossing it would put them closer to friendly lines, but it also meant passing through open ground. He explained the risk, and she surprised him by saying she could help guide them through without being seen. He studied her expression, wondering if this was another trap, but something in her tone carried conviction rather than deceit. They moved quickly, staying close to walls and moving only when the shadows were deep enough to hide them. Twice, they froze as patrols passed within meters, the sound of alien boots striking the pavement in perfect rhythm. She led them through a narrow service tunnel he never would have noticed, and it brought them out just a short distance from the water's edge. The path she chose had been dangerous, but it kept them alive. At the riverbank, Cale scanned for a way across. The bridges were heavily guarded, their silhouettes sharp against the glow of the fires. She pointed toward a half-sunken barge still tethered to a collapsed pier. It was risky, unstable, and might break apart halfway across, but it was their only chance. Without another word, they began moving toward it together, the sound of the river swallowing the chaos behind them. The barge groaned under their combined weight as they stepped onto its tilted deck. Water lapped at the edges, sending small ripples across the dark surface. Cale tested each step before shifting his full weight forward, his eyes scanning the shadows for movement. The alien woman followed closely, her gaze flicking between the unstable floor and the distant glow of the guarded bridge. Halfway across, a metallic creak split the air, and part of the deck gave way beneath Cale's boot. He caught himself, quickly gripping a rusted railing with one hand. She instinctively reached out to steady him, her fingers curling around his arm. For a brief moment, the noise of the river drowned out the distant war, and all that existed was the unspoken agreement that they needed each other to make it through. As they neared the midpoint, the river's current grew stronger, pressing against the battered vessel. Cale kept his balance by leaning into the tilt, but she struggled, her footing slipping more than once. Without hesitation, he shifted to her side and looped one arm around her waist, guiding her across. She tensed, at first unused to such contact, but did not pull away. The deck's uneven planks groaned beneath them, but they pressed on. A sharp flash erupted from the bank behind them, followed by the hiss of plasma rounds slicing the air. Cale's instincts kicked in, and he pushed her forward toward the safety of the far end. They ran across the last stretch of the deck, the sound of enemy shouts carrying over the water. The moment their boots hit the opposite shore, they both dropped low behind a cluster of broken concrete. The gunfire slowed, replaced by the hum of engines as patrol crafts searched the water. Cale kept his breathing steady while watching their movements. She glanced at him, her expression tight but no longer filled with suspicion. For the first time, she seemed to understand that his actions were not calculated for advantage, but driven by something else entirely. It was a thought she could not easily set aside. Once the patrols moved on, they left the cover of the rubble and entered a narrow path leading into an overgrown industrial zone. The ground here was soft with moss, muffling their footsteps. Rusted machinery loomed on either side, their skeletal frames wrapped in vines. She kept glancing upward, checking the shadows above for movement. While Cale listened for the faintest sound of pursuit, they found shelter inside the husk of an old loading station, its roof partially intact. Cale checked the entrances and set a small lantern on the ground between them. Its warm light cast long shadows, softening the harsh lines of her face. She studied him for a long moment before asking again why he risked himself for her. He answered in the same calm tone, saying that saving her felt like the right choice, no matter the cost. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more. Instead, she sat back against the wall, watching the flicker of the lantern. Cale leaned against a beam across from her, his injuries aching but ignored. Outside, the night carried the distant sounds of battle, yet inside, the space between them was quiet. It was not trust yet, but it was no longer open hostility either. Dawn crept slowly over the ruined horizon, its pale light cutting through the haze of smoke. Cale stirred from his light rest, scanning the edges of the loading station for movement. The alien woman was already awake, sitting near the doorway, with her blade resting across her knees. She did not look at him immediately, but her posture lacked the tension it had carried the night before. They set out again, moving through the outskirts of the industrial zone. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of damp metal and scorched earth. Birds, startled by distant explosions, scattered overhead in uneven patterns. Cale noticed she no longer kept as much distance from him, their strides matching naturally. As they navigated the rubble-strewn path, the city's edge was not far now, but the route ahead wound through a derelict transit tunnel. Its arched walls were cracked, and the lights that once guided passengers now hung dead and dark. Cale took the lead, stepping quietly over broken tiles while she followed, her eyes scanning the shadows. Somewhere deeper inside, the faint drip of water echoed like a slow heartbeat. Halfway through the tunnel, voices echoed from behind. They froze, listening as footsteps grew nearer. Cale gestured toward a maintenance alcove, and they slipped inside just as the patrol entered the tunnel. The alien woman pressed her back against the wall, her shoulder brushing against his. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, even as he prepared his weapon in silence. The patrol passed without spotting them, their footsteps fading into the distance. She exhaled slowly, realizing how close they had come to being discovered. Cale glanced at her briefly before signaling to move again. Neither spoke, but an unspoken understanding settled between them, born from the way they relied on each other's instincts in that moment. They emerged from the tunnel into a small courtyard overgrown with weeds. The remnants of shattered benches and fallen lampposts lay scattered across the cracked pavement. Cale scanned for movement while she examined the remains of an old fountain at the center. Her fingers traced over strange carvings in the stone, symbols from her people's history, and her eyes softened with a flicker of memory. Before she could linger, a sudden metallic clank echoed from the far side of the courtyard. Cale moved first, pulling her down behind a collapsed wall. A small scout drone hovered into view, its sensor eyes sweeping the area with sharp red light. She reached for her blade, but he raised a hand, waiting until the drone drifted away before they stood again. The caution kept them unseen. They pushed on, the city walls now visible through the thinning rows of broken buildings. The open ground beyond would be dangerous, but it meant freedom was close. Cale adjusted the strap on his pack, then glanced at her. She met his eyes for a moment, her expression unreadable, before giving a small nod. They stepped forward together, ready to face whatever waited beyond the walls. The open ground stretched before them like a challenge. The broken city walls stood tall but fractured, their once strong gates lying in jagged ruins. Beyond them, Cale could see the faint line of hills where safety might be found. The alien woman scanned the area, her eyes narrowing at the sight of enemy patrols moving in slow, sweeping arcs near the breaches in the wall. They moved low, slipping from one patch of cover to the next. A burned-out vehicle provided their first shelter, its frame still warm from some recent blast. Cale peered through a twisted gap in the metal, tracking the movement of a patrol unit ahead. She crouched beside him, her breathing steady despite the danger. There was no longer any hesitation in the way she matched his pace. As they reached the shadow of the wall, the sound of engines roared from behind. Cale turned in time to see an armored transport approaching fast, its mounted weapons already scanning the field. Without thinking, he grabbed her arm and pulled her into a narrow gap between two sections of broken stone. The space was barely wide enough for them to stand, their shoulders pressed close together. The transport passed, its noise fading into the distance. She looked up at him, her expression somewhere between disbelief and something she could not name. He did not release her arm until the silence returned, and even then, his hand lingered for a moment, longer than necessary. Neither of them commented on it as they began climbing over the last stretch of rubble toward the breach. A sudden shout rang out from above, and Cale spotted 2 enemy soldiers posted on the broken wall. They opened fire, plasma bolts scorching the air around them. Cale shoved her down behind a chunk of stone and returned fire with precision, dropping 1 soldier instantly. The other ducked for cover, giving them a chance to move. She followed his lead without question, her blade drawn and ready. They reached the breach, but another patrol was closing in from the other side. Cale's weapon was nearly empty, and his injuries slowed him. She stepped in front of him, deflecting incoming fire with a speed and skill that caught him off guard. Together, they fought their way through, the last soldier falling just as they stumbled into the open hills beyond the wall. The air outside was cleaner, the distant sound of battle muffled by the terrain. They slowed their pace, both breathing hard, their bodies marked with dirt, blood, and ash. She glanced at him, then away, as if unsure how to voice the thought forming in her mind. He caught her glance and gave a faint nod, an unspoken acknowledgement. Of everything they had endured together, they continued toward the hills, the fires of the city casting a dim glow behind them. The war was still raging, but here, there was a fragile sense of distance from it all. Neither knew what would come next, but both understood that their paths were now tied in ways they could not have imagined when they first met in the flames. They reached the first ridge of the hills, the rocky path winding upward beneath their boots. The air was sharper here, carrying the scent of untouched earth instead of smoke. Cale kept a steady pace despite the stiffness in his side, the wound from her earlier attack still aching. The alien woman glanced back at the burning city only once before focusing on the climb ahead. The higher they went, the more the sounds of battle faded. Wind whistled between jagged stones, and small patches of hardy plants clung to the cracks in the rock. She moved with a quiet determination now, no longer hesitating or looking for ways to break away from him. Cale noticed the shift but said nothing, letting the silence between them speak its own truths. At the crest, they paused to scan the valley below. In the distance, a narrow settlement lay tucked against a river bend, its rooftops glinting in the morning sun. It was a place that might offer shelter, though there was no telling whether it would welcome them. She studied it with a guarded expression, her thoughts unreadable. Cale adjusted his pack and began the descent. The slope down was steeper than expected, and loose gravel slid under their feet. At one point, she stumbled, but his hand shot out to catch her. Their eyes met briefly, and she did not pull away until her balance returned. Neither of them mentioned it, but the contact lingered in the space between them as they continued downward. Halfway to the valley floor, they stopped near a shallow cave to rest. Cale leaned against the rock wall, scanning the surrounding ridges for movement. She sat across from him, her posture relaxed but her gaze still sharp. After a long moment, she asked if humans always protected those who tried to harm them. His answer was simple sometimes, but not always, and not without reason. Her brow furrowed at that, as if weighing his words against her own beliefs. She admitted that in her culture, mercy often led to betrayal, and kindness was a weakness to be exploited. Cale responded that perhaps in some cases it was true, but sometimes it was the only way to break the cycle. She did not reply, but her expression shifted as though a part of her wanted to believe him. When they resumed walking, the settlement grew clearer in view. Thin trails of smoke rose from its chimneys, a sign of life that felt strangely calm. After the chaos of the city, Cale stayed alert, but his steps were less tense now. She walked beside him without keeping her hand on her weapon, a quiet signal that she no longer saw him as an enemy first. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows behind them. The path into the settlement was narrow, lined with weathered stone markers, carved with symbols neither of them recognized. They moved forward together, the noise of the river mixing with the faint hum of voices ahead, each step carrying them deeper into a place where their fates would soon be decided. The settlement was smaller than it looked from the ridge. Modest houses made of stone and timber lined the central path, their windows shuttered against the unfamiliar sight of strangers. Cale walked with measured steps, his gaze moving across the rooftops and doorways. The alien woman kept pace beside him, her posture calm but alert to every movement in the shadows. They were stopped by two local guards at the edge of the central square. Both wore mismatched armor, patched from years of use, and carried spears tipped with jagged steel. The guards demanded to know who they were and why they had come. Cale kept his voice steady, explaining they were travelers seeking only rest and safety. The alien woman said nothing, but her eyes held a quiet challenge as they studied her. After a tense pause, the guards allowed them through on the condition they stayed in sight. They were led to a small storage building near the river, where they could rest until the elders decided whether to trust them. The room was bare save for a table, 2 chairs, and a stack of firewood in the corner. Cale sat with his back to the wall while she remained standing, watching the door as if expecting trouble. Hours passed before an elder entered, a tall man with weathered skin and eyes that spoke of long years of war. He listened to Cale's brief account of the burning city, of the patrols, and of their escape. The alien woman added little, though her gaze flickered toward Cale when he spoke of carrying her through the flames. The elder said the settlement had little to give, but would not turn away those in need. For the first time since the fire, they felt a measure of safety. A meal was brought: simple bread, roasted roots, and a jug of clean water. They ate in silence, the tension of survival slowly giving way to something quieter. She caught Cale watching her once and raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He gave a faint, tired smile before finishing his bread. That night, they slept in the storage room, the sounds of the river just beyond the walls. In the dim light of dawn, she woke to find him already awake, checking his gear. When she asked where he planned to go, he simply said he would head where he was needed next. There was no demand for her to follow, only the unspoken knowledge that she could choose. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. She thought of the moment she had first struck him, of the heat of the fire, and of how he had carried her when he should have left her behind. Slowly, she stepped outside and matched his stride, her decision made without a word. Cale glanced at her once but did not speak, accepting her choice as if it had always been certain. They left the settlement together, the rising sun casting gold across the valley. Ahead lay unknown dangers, but neither looked back. The war might still rage beyond the hills, yet between them, something had shifted forever. What began with a blade in the shadows had ended with 2 lives bound by fire and survival.